All right, welcome to Forward's expert industry conversation, Get into the Fast Lane, electrifying climate action in your community. We have a distinguished panel of experts with us today, each bringing a unique perspective on how government and nonprofit leaders can strategize and drive climate action opportunities in their communities using human-centered technology. I am Asia Brown, Strategic Impact Partner for Forward Platform, and also former mayor of Compton, California. Forward is just quickly a mission-driven company focused on accelerating access and equity for opportunities. We partner with governments and organizations to deliver resources and funding to their communities using human-centered technology and custom data-driven solutions. Today, I'm honored to be joined by a dynamic host of leaders from across the nation. For the sake of time, I'm going to ask this wonderful panel to provide self-introductions, and I'll kick it off to Mayor Rex Richardson.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Asia and Forward, for this invitation to participate with all of you today about the work we're doing in Long Beach to build a more sustainable, climate-centered economy and the important role that we play in a zero-emissions future. I'm mayor of the city of Long Beach, a top 40 city in the United States with about 500,000 residents, home to the Port of Long Beach, which is a top 2 port in the United States, $3.2 billion budget, and sort of a forward-thinking city that is greening our ports and leading with a climate action adaptation plan and a clean air action plan that will help to lead our city and our state and our region as it relates to advancing zero emissions technology. So thanks a lot. Look forward to contributing to the conversation.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll also introduce Kwame Reed, who is the acting city manager at the city of Antioch, California.
Good morning, all. Kwame Reed, acting city manager, city of Antioch, California. We are a city that sits on the San Joaquin River. We're about an hour directly east of San Francisco without traffic, of course. Our population right now is about 115,000. We have a wonderful community, a vibrant workforce, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with this panel today to talk about the public-private partnership and the advantages that we have seen working with Forward over the last about a year and a half. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Stephen Goldsmith, a revered urban policy expert throughout the United States and the world from Harvard. Dr. Goldsmith.
Thank you, Asia. First of all, I got to begin before my introduction with complaining about the background. I heard the other guys talk about it. I am former mayor of Indianapolis, which has this little race called the Indianapolis 500, and you've got the totally wrong racing background for this whole thing. But let me just put that out there. So I'm a professor of urban policy at the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard University. I'm the former mayor of Indianapolis and the deputy mayor of New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goldsmith. And last but certainly not least, the just revered and well-respected Mr. Marcus Mason, who is a political expert and has served multiple presidential administrations. Mr. Mason.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. I truly appreciate that introduction. And the Mayor Goldsmith, look, it's all open wheel driving love. Okay. Goldsmith, Mayor Richardson, NTT and Formula One share two things in common, and that they're both committed to getting to net zero by a year certain. And they both have very fast cars, very complex machinery, even though one has more left turns than the other. So, but thank you for having me. And Madam Mayor, I wear a couple of different hats, and I'll probably wear a couple of different hats on this, especially since I am an ambassador for the Biden administration. I'm going to probably dig more into the Inflation Reduction Act 12 months later, especially since we're celebrating, we're in the process of celebrating that anniversary.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mr. Mason. We look forward to you sharing your invaluable insight. So let's rev up and kick off our conversation. There's $370 billion available to communities through this landmark policy package, the Inflation Reduction Act, which stands today as the largest investment by Congress to date to address climate change and structural economic injustice through stimulating targeted economic development. This is a significant step forward for climate action in the United States and is expected to create millions of new jobs, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve air quality. Many government and nonprofit leaders are wondering how can they access IRA funding and drive clean energy adoption in their communities. So now we're going to just stop and take a pit stop and do a quick poll. How many of us here in this webinar are actively pursuing opportunities from the Inflation Reduction Act? I'm going to hand it over to Tina to launch a quick poll. And Tina, you can let us know when our results are in.
It looks like around 53% of participants said yes, they're actively pursuing opportunities from the Inflation Reduction Act, and then around 44% say no.
Okay, wonderful. Never too late to get started. It is brand new, as Mr. Mason shared. This is the 1-year anniversary. However, many programs have just begun to roll out and make their way down into communities. So we're happy to get into the details of how you can activate today. One of the most impactful components of the Inflation Reduction Act is Justice 40. Justice 40 is a commitment from the Biden-Harris administration that at least 40% of federal climate investments must go directly to communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. For the first question, I'd like to ask some of our panelists to share what they see as the most pressing challenge that Justice 40 communities face in accessing these funds through the IRA and how local leaders should respond. And I'm going to ask Dr. Goldsmith to start us off here.
Yeah, thanks for the question. There are a couple ways to think about the answer to the question. I did a little paper at Harvard on equity and placemaking, right? So how do you look? The Justice 40 definitions are important and have given the country a lot of impetus from the Biden administration, but they're still a little large in their geographical description. So how does a city drill down on spatial inequities inside the J40 categories is one issue. But you asked two questions, Asia. One is how to help folks in those communities. The other is how local government should. And let me just try to do this quickly, as you do have a distinguished panel. I had a grant from a foundation to help a number of cities apply for Department of Transportation, what were called SMART grants. And what I found as I did that was the following, that cities were so overwhelmed with their day-to-day work that they were not really equipped to fill out the grants to chase the dollars. That was one issue. The second issue was that there was not an initiative at the top of those cities that brought together all their agencies so that transportation people might want to apply for a transportation grant, environmental people and sustainability for this grant. So the city really needed, those cities that were successful in applying for those grants had a person very close to the mayor responsible for putting together the team. They then contracted with somebody to actually help write the grant, right? And so that what the city needs to do is help its residents in those J40 categories access those dollars, whether the dollars go directly to the individuals or the dollars go through the city. And then lastly, I think we've seen that there is so much, cities have a lot of money now, but they're not going to have a lot of money in the future. So how can they take advantage of these grants that are in the system? And Asia, you know this because you helped solve this problem, but when we saw how many cities had not spent their rental assistance dollars, even while residents were being evicted from their homes, that was a capacity issue. So what's the role of public-private partnerships in helping cities help the residents in the J40 communities?
Thank you, Stephen. You've shared quite a bit of just nuggets to be clear. And we'll definitely, I think, come back to some of those key topics, but the lack of agency capacity, needing to fill that gap with grant writers, and then really figuring out the most expedient way to get funding to individuals and cities. And then again, the underscoring of capacity issues. Most cities are only utilizing or spending about 50% of their federal or state funding appropriations, where there obviously are outliers with cities like the city of Long Beach that have just historic, very efficient administration. But for small cities and in most of Justice 40 communities, that is going to be an issue. So now I'm going to hand it over to Marcus Mason, who I believe has a very rich perspective on this.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And first, let's start by going backwards to go forward. Let's remember where and how the Justice 40 initiative began. It began with an idea by then House Majority Leader James Clyburn called the 10-20-30 program that mandated that 10% of all federal funding go to those communities that had a persistent poverty rate of 20% for more than 30 years. As you know, the role that, as everyone knows, the role that he played in the president's campaign and how he advises the president, they simply took that 10-20-30 concept, expanded it, put it on steroids, and now we have what's called Justice 40, where 40% is going to those environmentally impacted communities. Let me say this: the federal government has an immense ability to dole out money, but as you just said, and as Mayor Goldsmith just said, local governments are not all like Mayor Richardson's city or Mayor Bass's city, and that have the capacity to bring those funds in and then to get those funds out. This is what we refer to as the last mile problem. And that problem exists not just with Justice 40, not just with the infrastructure, with the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill. It also exists with the FCC's broadband deployment. There is a last mile issue in all these programs because every city and every county is not as equipped or as disciplined, and I don't want anyone to take this the wrong way, but as disciplined as a city of Long Beach or a city of Inglewood or a city of Los Angeles. I'm a Californian, so I'm a bit biased. Even large cities like Chicago, because of the way their ward system is developed, they weren't able to readily take those funds in and then easily deploy them to the places in which they could go. They had a process. So in many instances, I believe that streamlining those processes or having a tool that streamlines that process for those local governments and even in some states, I think is needed to get beyond that last mile problem. The Deputy Secretary of Treasury, Wale Adeyemo, mentioned this as one of the Treasury Department's greatest challenges in deploying funds. It really is that last mile issue. And so, where Mayor Richardson can be effective and where Mayor Bass can be effective is helping their colleagues understand how their cities, not necessarily how they work, but what they do to deploy those funds as quickly as possible. I hope that answered the question, Mayor Brown.
Absolutely, Mr. Mason. And I think our next question will really glean from our city leaders to just share their experience and expertise of how they're solving this last mile problem. And I'll just quickly share that to the point that all cities are different and unique and have very structural challenges and differences of how they deal with the last mile hurdle. Obviously, I served as mayor in the city of Compton for 8 years, but also served in government administration for a total of 20 years with other cities as well in the Southland of California. And the challenge is the same. There's funding that comes from the federal, sometimes through the state to the county to cities, but the capacity and those gaps of the local administrators to, number one, they're trying to get basic services to their constituents. That is a direct and pressing priority. And then when new sources of funds are made available that all have their very unique requirements of how they deploy those funds, it creates a gap and really an inbuilt systemic structural inequality between smaller cities or under-resourced cities and those that are more structurally advanced. So really just commend James Clyburn and the Biden-Harris administration for recognizing that Justice 40 must exist in order to address the structural inequalities that are pervasive and demonstrated in the economic and environmental injustice, which really this policy package seeks to address. So for the second topic, would love to just get into some specifics. We're going to talk a little bit about how just really hearing from you all of the role that technology plays in your current climate action strategies, and just generally how you are utilizing technology to get resources out to your community quickly. So I'm going to hand it over to Mayor Richardson. Mayor, you referenced that last year your administration approved the Long Beach Climate Action Plan. Could you just share some high-level specifics of this plan and elaborate on how technology will really assist your city in achieving its structural objectives?
Sure, and thanks for that question. We know that we, again, are a port city. We're a city with deep roots in oil production. You know, it's more than 100 years since we've been producing oil in our city, and Long Beach is home to the biggest oil field in the United States at the Wilmington oil fields. And so, you know, just like the movie There Will Be Blood, those guys were from Signal Hill. They would go out prospecting for oil. That was Long Beach's history. That's why Long Beach State was the 49ers. That's why this year we celebrate 100 years since, you know, a hospital and a bank and an airport, because we're the fastest growing city in America in 1923, because we were experiencing oil boom. And it was the same year that North Long Beach annexed into the city of Long Beach, my neighborhood, and it only took us 99 years to get a mayor from North Long Beach. But I digress. So we're in a place now that we're actually thinking about what the future looks like. We generate upwards of $80 million to our uplands and our tightlands fund that helps support general services in our city, like police officers, firefighters, lifeguards, parks, you know, maintenance. And, you know, as California moves away from fossil fuels, those resources we can't depend on anymore. And so the last drop of oil won't come out of Long Beach while I'm mayor, but the guidelines for the transition will be established while I'm mayor. We'll understand what the future looks like, which means we have to spend some time focusing on growing our economy in new and more sustainable directions. And technology plays a huge part in that. And then on the other hand, we have responsibility today to our climate. And that's why we've been, you know, putting a lot of focus on climate action adaptation. We adopted a very comprehensive climate action adaptation plan here in Long Beach that sets us on course to carbon neutrality by 2045, and that's 5 years ahead of Los Angeles. And because of the scale and impact of our port, we're a big port environment. It's important to our state, important to our region. We have to make sure that we lean into the environmental progress at our port so that economic progress and environmental progress aren't mutually exclusive. So to give you an example of the scale, 1/5 of all containers that move across the United States comes to the Port of Long Beach, 1/5. Combine that with the Port of Long Beach is 1/5. If you combine that with Los Angeles, 43% of everything that comes to the United States comes through these combined seaports. 15% of all trade in the United States goes over our Long Beach International Gateway Bridge, our bridge. One bridge we have in Long Beach, 15% of all cargo goes to that area. And so where does technology come in? As we move to modernize our ports to make it cleaner and faster and, you know, make throughput easier. If we don't get it right, you know, we don't deliver Christmas. But what we have to do is double down on electrification within our ports. There's multiple benefits on electrification. One, building the infrastructure creates jobs. Two, as a truck or a train, a zero emission locomotive or a truck pulls up and charges, well, we tax that. We tax electricity, and that becomes a revenue source to our city to help support things like police officers and firefighters and help offset our dependency on oil revenue. But the third and probably most important benefit to electrification is zero emissions. It cleans the air on the west side of Long Beach and in our region. Why is that important? Well, on the west side of Long Beach, those are families who experience some of the worst health impacts in our nation. We're talking about a 17-year difference in life expectancy between West Long Beach and East Long Beach, largely driven by environmental conditions. And so what does that What does that mean for us? That means we have to do all that we can to layer technology strategies, to have the best available, cleanest technology to continue to move goods and cargo, and that we need to leverage opportunities like Inflation Reduction Act to make it easy for nonprofits and community groups to take advantage of these opportunities because they meet all the criteria of a Justice 40 criteria. And so those dedicated local pots of funding leveraged against federal and state funding are the ways that we can layer together to create, impact that helps those communities reach their highest and fullest potential.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for sharing your insight. And Long Beach definitely is leading the way in your response and strategy to executing on IRA. I'd love to just shift over to our acting city manager for Antioch, Mr. Kwame. When tackling large issues such as climate change, we know we can't be successful alone. If you could share just how public-private partnerships has really accelerated success and engagement for your community under your leadership. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I mean, leadership has been here since June 23rd, so I'm just in 3 months. Prior to that, I'm the economic development director for the city, and that's where I first was introduced to the Forward platform. In our city currently, we oversee, from the economic development standpoint, roughly about 2,500 small businesses. Our city council was very fortunate at the time when the ARPA funding was coming down. I know it's a different pot of money than the IRA stuff, but the ARPA funding came down to us, and our council allocated just over $1 million that we could pass out to small businesses for both facade improvements and small business grants in the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. At the time when the money was provided to the Economic Development Department, you were looking at the entire department. I was a staff of one, me, myself, and I. And without a platform like Forward that could come in, understand the program, understand from their experience on working in the ARPA field previously, they made me look good. They were able to come in, basically create a website, an online platform that our businesses were able to go to, realize that it was a function of the city, apply for these grants. Forward then took all the due diligence and went through and vetted all the applicants so that when they were brought back to me, it was a list of people that could get funded. The Forward team also did all the heavy lifting of requesting additional information. If somebody didn't fill out the application properly, they took their time and effort with their team to reach back out to those small businesses to make sure that the information that we got was what we needed, and that in the end we were able to get the funding to them, because that's what the program was really all about. Currently right now as a city manager, I'm realizing that we are probably sitting on about a 25% vacancy of employees. So without having a group like Forward that can do some of the work of staff, including the grant intake, as well as identifying future grant opportunities for us, it makes it very hard for us to serve what we're all here for, the community and the residents, whether small businesses or others. So it's really the partnership. I mean, it's really what is helping us get through the times of, I think every city is probably having a vacancy and employment shortage, just like any other industry. But, it really hurts us because we really want to get the information out to and services out to our community. So I really appreciate the work that I've done thus far with Forward.
Thank you, Mr. Reed, for sharing that. And I personally decided to come really make contributions to communities across the nation through Forward because of that exact ability of being able to not just design custom tech solutions, but to really help build capacity and get resources to people that need it most. We obviously are coming out of the pandemic, and there are still communities across the nation that haven't utilized those resources. So technology and partnership from a human-centered perspective could really move mountains in places that really need it. But shifting back to the Inflation Reduction Act, There's the consumer funds and the community funds. So there are $8.8 billion earmarked for rebates for home energy efficiency upgrades, electrification projects for residents and business owners. Stephen, can you just share your take on how government agencies can ensure that tech solutions for climate action are inclusive and benefit all residents?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the constructive stories that we've heard from Antioch and Long Beach, although there was a long Long Beach commercial before we actually got to the answer to the question. I think, Rex, I was impressed with how much of our cargo goes through your city. Let me just answer it this way. There's so many opportunities now, right? As you mentioned, there are opportunities that go directly to individuals. There are federal opportunities that go to states and then go to cities. There are federal funds that go to cities and then to individuals. There's federal funds for the city. So it's a pretty bewildering list of array of funding, right? And so whether it's environmental justice grants or EV grants or weatherization grants or low-income housing energy assistance grants, or right, I mean, we could go on for quite a while. I think Asia, or I should probably call you mayor, actually, since you're calling all, I'm a retiree and you're still calling me mayor, so that's good. Let's think about this in two or three different ways. One is, how do you design a system that's friendly to the resident, right? If we're all used to using our cell phones, right? Those are user-friendly experiences on our phone. So how do we, government, design a user-friendly experience for residents that allow them to take advantage of these opportunities? So I would answer two ways. One is that the city needs assistance in qualifying for the various grants that it can take advantage of. And then those cities can use technology to help them administer the grants, right? Because there's always a little bit of tug of war between people worried about accountability and fraud and those interested in speed and getting the money out. And to have a technology platform like Forward allows you to do both, right? It allows you to draw down the funding, utilize the funding, and have enough technological infrastructure to protect as best one can against fraud, waste, and abuse. So that's one set of things. A second set of things is I wrote this little article for Governing Magazine about Multnomah County. And part of Multnomah County, the county government decided that what they wanted to do is help individuals qualify for the funds that they might not otherwise be able to take advantage of. So they created their own kind of front door to say, well, we're going to have a third party, in this case it was Ford again, help those residents qualify for the array of funding. So if you're eligible for a weatherization grant, then maybe you're most likely eligible for a low-income housing energy assistance program, or maybe you're on SNAP and therefore you're eligible for. So I would just summarize the role of technology is to make the qualifications, the ability of folks who qualify for benefits, that should be as easy as possible. And technology can do that while at the same time providing the accountability trails that we need for audit purposes. And government has a responsibility to both look up at the local government, at the federal government to take down more money, and to look towards our residents to help them take advantage of it. And I think a user-friendly experience on both sides will enable us to do that.
And Mayor Goldsmith, I just want to add to your point, not just a user-friendly experience, but a user-friendly experience that helps the resident and the city do the proper due diligence, but also manage the compliance work. So many times when government issues these big programs, there are people who slip through the cracks because there are always bad actors out there who want to defraud the government, who want to get something that they are not otherwise entitled to, but also want to defraud the citizen. Technology is the great equalizer in that way, in that it cuts across so many different verticals and allows the local government to not just do the due diligence and know their citizen. In certain worlds, they call it know your customer, but for this purpose with Forward, you can call it know your citizen, know your corporate citizen, your small business. But it also helps with the compliance side of it when there is an oversight committee that is formed to look at spending irregularities that may have occurred in a particular government program. And that allows a city like Antioch or a city like Long Beach or a city like Compton to come forward and say, hey, we have the receipts here. Or a city like Indianapolis, we have the receipts here. So these funds were used appropriately. We knew our citizens, we knew our corporate citizens, and we did the necessary compliance to get this program out to those citizens with the velocity that the federal government required.
Hey, Asia, I don't want to talk more than my turn, but can I just punctuate this by Marcus? This is such an important point because there's always been this view that you have to go slowly and methodically to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse. And when you go slowly and methodically, you hurt people because they need the money today. So how can you do both? And the answer is through technology. That was such an important point. I just wanted to reiterate it.
Absolutely. And just quickly before we transition, I uniquely have a vantage point of what's happening in communities across the nation in the role that I share with Forward. But there is, like never before, fraud attempting to occur in communities through these aid programs. We've seen an average of 20% of fraud being able to be stopped through technology with the programs that just Forward administers. So I can only imagine just the magnitude and the waste of tax dollars that are being defrauded every single day because antiquated systems are being used. So technology is not only necessary for speed, but it's also, in my perspective, just a way to be a responsible steward of public resources. I'm going to, for the sake of time, I want to hear from Mayor Richardson, who does have to exit 10 minutes to the hour. Mayor Richardson, it's really wonderful to see how Long Beach is just leading the way on several elements related to climate action, the Inflation Reduction Act, and then generally your approach to program administration. If you could just share what the advice that you have for other leaders in their communities to really get ahead of the game.
Well, here's what I would say, and I appreciate hearing much of the conversation here. I would say big city or small, or whether there's intent to do fraud or not, sometimes government misses the mark. I talked a little bit about the west side of Long Beach earlier and some of the challenges there. Even though Long Beach is a big city and we do apply for grants and we are one of the ones who typically does well, we still have left entire communities behind because we haven't looked at things from a lens of equity for long enough. And when you layer together all the sort of systemic challenges from redlining to the placement of the freeways, where investment has taken place, where industry has been allowed to grow and proliferate, whereas as opposed to where open space has been able to grow in other areas, has really created this tale of two cities. And so we have to think about how we tend to our garden differently as a community. I like to refer to our communities as gardens. Mm-hmm. And if you were to, look at a garden that has had consistent investment, watering, tending to, it bears fruit. But if you look at a community that's been neglected for 40, 50 years, it's like a garden that's been starved of nutrients. It's not gonna look like a garden anymore. Right. But you can't just walk away and say, oh, well, let's go somewhere else. You got to do the hard work of reinvesting in that garden, taking real account and inventory for what needs to happen. Investments need to be made. And that means you need to place a lens of equity. Mm-hmm. I think Inflation Reduction Act and being smart and strategic around technology and developing platforms that can hold the government itself accountable on making sure applications are being made, making sure that We're tracking how many nonprofits, community-based organizations are participating in certain areas, making sure that dollars being deployed to certain areas allows us to, have a strategic way to invest in those communities. I'll tell you, on the West Side, it's West Side of Long Beach is home to, it's a very diverse community, proud working families, Latinos, Cambodians, Filipinos, Black folks, working families, plenty of schools. And despite those characteristics, they've been on the front line. They've borne the brunt. And so we have to leverage opportunities like Inflation Reduction Act, which is 10 years of funding. We have to leverage that to make sure this community can achieve its highest and best potential. And over the next decade, we should be developing technology platforms and strategies that make it easy for the average nonprofit, community-based organization, business to take advantage of that funding. And then on the government side, we have to make sure that the Port of Long Beach stands up funding, and to layer on top of that to make sure that they are investing over the next 10 years, that our state partners and legislators, when they're funding requests, that they're putting a lens of West Side on there. Our federal funding requests, federal partners are putting a lens there, that all of our city departments are approaching it the way that, we do place-based initiatives like Promise Zones, where every federal department can invest in one area. Well, we should be looking at that as it relates to city departments too. And so my recommendations to local communities is don't shy away from the big challenges. They're big challenges, you just take them on first, right? If the West Side thrives, so should all the rest of our communities thrive. And Inflation Reduction Act is tremendous opportunities to think about things like open space and greening your fleets. And we're looking at things at our municipal airport. We're developing a platform right now, just like we did during the pandemic. We're exploring taking some of the lessons learned from ARPA and deploying some of those strategies on Inflation Reduction Act and really leaning into Justice 40. If Long Beach is the kind of city where we're, small enough to where we can be nimble. Half a million residents, 9 council members. You get 5 people in a room, you can't break Brown Act, but you get 5 people on the same page, you can pretty much get anything done. But we're big enough to where when we get it right, the nation pays attention, the region pays attention. Our satellite cities around us say, hey, let's do what Long Beach does. They got it figured out. LA will say, hey, Long Beach has it figured out. They're 1/8 of the size of LA. So let's look at them as a test case and maybe scale it across LA, which is, number 2 city in America. And so, take on the big challenges, be intersectional, bring the right coalitions together, labor, community partners, environmental groups, state and county partners, and think about what we can do if we all work together. So that would be my advice for our audience.
Thank you, Mayor.
Sure.
You shared just some valuable strategy that is very actionable and effective. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the questions that we have in the queue. We will definitely get to those questions through this webinar, and we'll also follow up with FAQs and send that out to the list just so that everyone has access to this information. One of the elements, Mayor, that you just identified is really the coalitions, the strategy, really tackling the big problems first, but then also really like layering funding. And one of the questions that I'll just touch on now to highlight is that IRA obviously is one specific source of funds that has a 10-year time frame. The question that we have is, how is this different from CDBG? And so I just want to underscore everything that you just described is just how do you leverage funding to be able to achieve strategic and audacious objectives. And so this is definitely a layering and a stimulus mechanism that I know I'll actually ask Mr. Marcus Mason to touch on in just a second. And so this is our final panelist question, and then we'll get into some Q&A. Mr. Mason, could you just share your advice for just governmental, even nonprofit leaders on how they should approach accessing funding for IRA?
So thank you, Madam Mayor. I've seen some of the questions in the Q&A and in the chat, but I can just take this on from some of the questions that we've gotten and that I've gotten over time since the legislation has passed, since the law has been enacted. Some people simply don't know what's in the IRA. Some people simply don't know what's in ARPA. Some people simply didn't understand what was in the stimulus package. And so first, I think you have to understand what's in them and do the quick study on what those funds can be used for. They are actually overlapping sources of funding from the federal government to allow you to, as Mayor Reed said, uplift a facade on your building. That's one. But two is then the infrastructure bill allows you to replace the infrastructure and improve the infrastructure in front of said building. I mean, they're all designed to complement each other, and they're all designed to help those communities who have the most need to really improve themselves. And as Mayor Richardson said, make what happens on the west side of a city, let that come over to the south and east sides of cities. It's to make everyone, these programs were intended to make everyone benefit. The president, when he won, after he won the election, said he wanted to be the most transformational president in the history of this country. And everyone in the room paused for a second. They didn't quite grasp what he was saying, but then he repeated himself. And look, he has managed to achieve that. He has done through these pieces of legislation more than any other president in the history of this country, but also he's exceeded what President Roosevelt did with the New Deal. And it was done smartly. It was done to adjust the time, to adjust to the times that we live in. And so, the easiest way that I can say is understand what's in them, understand that they are all complementary of each other. They're not the same as CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, which the name pretty much says what it does in and of itself. These are designed to accent and to complement, but also go further. These are new pieces, these are new sources of funding with new regulations tied to them that allow cities and localities and nonprofits to go just a little bit further, in fact, a lot further than what they could have through past and older funding programs. They're not made to replace. They are made to expand upon, to expand upon those existing programs.
Thank
I
you,
can
Mr.
let
Mayor.
someone who's done this from sort of a sort of practitioner level add to that.
Absolutely. I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Goldsmith to just share his insight on how communities can qualify and then utilize those funds. And then I'll weigh in briefly from a practitioner standpoint of how I view these packages working in unison.
Yes, I think Mr. Mason said it pretty well. I don't think I had to add much. I would not, the questions are good, but I would avoid looking at this as should I apply for ARPA, or should I use IRA, or should I use CDBG? The issue is, how do we get these to mesh together? How can my community and my residents take advantage of as many of those programs as possible in a leveraged and comprehensive way? Some of the programs in IRA go directly to the residents. That's another distinction from CDBG, which goes to the local and state governments, depending on the size of the government. So I would think about it in the following, and let me just say, then I'll close. Most of the cities on the call today, well, all the cities use mapping, and most of them use Esri. And Esri has a spatial equity index, right? So you could look at transportation investments by geography and demography. You could look at energy investments. You could look at the historic legacy of redlining and how and its effect on investment in those neighborhoods. So I think mapping and looking at the disparities, right? So here are the disparities in housing and energy and transportation and access. And here are the funds we can use to mitigate or ameliorate those would be the way to do it. And then lastly, I think once you do that, you would say, I'm going to use technology to both and outside consultants to help me draw down the money. And I'm going to use technology to help me distribute the money. And so then government becomes an enabler for its citizens who deserve help on looking up and looking down.
Thank you, Stephen, and you've provided just very succinct methodology. And I'll speak from the practitioner from the city level. Having the roadmap is one element, but then having the capacity to deploy the strategy is another. And so one of the initiatives or really efforts that I helped launch with Forward is a social impact / collaborative grants arm of the work that Forward does. So recognizing that having tech solutions and strategy is one thing, but being able to have the technical expertise to really devise a custom strategy for your community and then executing grant writing to make sure that you are positioning your community to access those competitive funds. So that is a direct invitation to access Forward for no obligation strategy sessions. I love uplifting communities. Is something I've dedicated my career to. And so this is something that we do as a service to communities, providing just an overview of strategy, giving an outlook, and then really helping to identify the right combination for that particular community. Communities are unique as fingerprints. One strategy will not fit another community. And so it's really exciting, the tech tools that we have to understand exactly what's happening in your community from a demographic and data standpoint, and then designing some custom solutions and strategy. The other element, we're going to switch into the Q&A portion. And I just want to take a moment to, number one, thank this distinguished panel for just enlightening discussion. You all have definitely helped communities and leaders get into the fast lane to understand what IRA is all about and how to access and utilize this funding for their communities to make transformation happen. We'll continue to collaborate to drive forward the climate action and economic justice agenda in our communities. We're going to just take one moment to do a quick poll. We'd like to know, let us know if you would like to see what you would like to see from us regarding the IRA. We understand that the challenges that government and nonprofit leaders face, and our goal is to help really get resources into your communities. So feel free to answer the poll. This will really direct us on how we invest in designing tools and resources. And as you all complete this poll, I want to invite you to go to Forward Platform's website. There is a very robust resource section that has tons of information on the Inflation Reduction Act and how you can really start consuming information to position your community to be effective. And I'll wait for Tina to share the results of those polls, or we can actually come back toward the end. And I'll extend the floor to a Q&A by our panelists while we have them here. Go ahead, Marcus. Yes.
Mayor Brown, I want to expand on what Mayor Goldsmith said, and just you know, in the church, they say make it plain.
Yes.
Don't get stuck with paralysis by analysis when it comes to all of these programs. I once talked to a mayor who received somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million from HUD for housing programs during the pandemic. And the words that came out of his mouth were, I don't know what to do with all this money. I don't know how it works against anything else. So don't get paralyzed by trying to analyze and think through and overthink things when deploying it to the citizens is the sort of mission and function. And that's where I think we've all said, and this entire panel agrees, that technology in most instances is the great equalizer, because it helps you draw it down and get it in, and then it helps you disperse it out to those communities, those businesses, and those people that are in need, does the proper due diligence, and then takes care of the compliance so that when, and it's never just if, it's always when there's an oversight committee set up to monitor that it shows that the due diligence was done and that the compliance was done and that the bad actors were dealt with on the front end, as many as could be dealt with. So I just wanted to add that point and emphasize that point.
Yeah, Mayor Brown, I would like to just kind of piggyback on that as well. When we were using the Forward platform for some of the ARPA funding, and as Mr. Mason just mentioned, the front end side of things, for some of our facade improvement grants, it was only eligible for QCT, so qualified census tract. So we were able to use the Forward platform, pull down a census map that clearly showed applicants whether or not they were within that qualified census tract, so that they can then apply directly. And that just saved us some more headache in the end of, having someone go through the entire process thinking that they might be eligible for some funding, and then to find out that, oh, sorry, you weren't in a QCT where we were only allowed to use certain parts of the ARPA funding. The flip side of that is also some of the folks talking about people that might not be intentionally wanting to scam the system, but not quite understanding maybe what a financial loss is. For some of our small business grants, we were requiring a 25% small business loss in revenue over the pandemic. Because of Forward and the technology that was utilized, there were some people that came in that had $300,000 plus revenue. And so obviously they weren't eligible, but we found that out very early on in the process. So once again, we weren't in a situation where some funding might have got distributed to people that weren't eligible in the end. So technology is really helpful, especially for smaller cities and smaller staff cities. And yeah, I just want to add that much. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Reed. And your really powerful points echo what's been shared, that technology really is a great equalizer, regardless of city size or capacity. So that's a really powerful point. I will now, I recognize we have about 6 more minutes, but I will take the time to answer a few of the questions, and many of you have already answered several. We also have our poll results out. Really exciting to see what you all are focusing on, and on the strategy and grant writing and implementation support. Definitely will be reaching out and making available, just again, no obligation, just strategy session. Our objective is to ensure that communities are equipped to serve their communities widely. That's a part of our contribution to communities in the marketplace and to support leadership. So excited to have our policy experts weigh in and support your work that you all are leading. For one of the questions that we have is, what is the expected ratio of dollars going direct versus indirect for Justice 40? I'll take a stab at it and then I can hand it over to whomever. But the design of Justice 40, as Mr. Mason shared earlier, is really a 40% set aside of the total Inflation Reduction Act package to underserved or historically underserved communities. And so there is a direct 40% set aside. Now, within those set asides, there are specific funding made available automatically to communities. And then there's a large competitive pool of funds that must be applied like any other standard grant program. And then there's also, as was mentioned earlier, there are consumer funds, so going directly to residents. And then also there are funds earmarked directly for business, and then also for manufacturing and other users. So there are lanes of funding, and there's also additional information. We've really condensed the package for easy consumption on the resource guide that we mentioned earlier. I can hand it over to any others that can get more specific.
You all know the specific answer to that better than I do. Let me just back up and get out of the federal language for a second. I have a program I manage here at Harvard for chiefs of staff and one for chief equity officers. If we stand back and we say to ourselves, where are children, particularly children of color, suffering childhood asthma because of carbon? Where are older citizens having cardiac events because of carbon, right? Where are elderly residents unable to stay in their homes because the weatherization is so bad, right? And then keep asking those questions. That will drive the Justice 40 answer, right? Because Justice 40 just really recognizes the residual effects of that discrimination over time. And I'm not saying anything different than you said. I'm just kind of backing it up to, even if you don't take it as a statistical issue, you take it as a what's right in your community and how can you help people, it will drive you to the same locations and even bigger percentages, I would predict.
Thank you, Stephen, for that. Marcus?
And you know, Mayor Goldsmith touched on something, and I think those questions can be asked by what Mayor Richardson touched on, bringing diverse coalitions together to ask those questions, because it's the people on the ground who know what's happening best in their cities. In Washington, D.C., for example, you have a city council, but you also have ANCs, which are neighborhood advisory committees. These folks are closer to the ground in many instances than those council members are, and they report up to the council member. The city of Los Angeles has something similar. I think other cities around the country have something similar. But when you ask those questions that Mayor Goldsmith, when you bring those groups together and have them ask those questions, it beats, you know, it simply complements the statistical data, but it also points out and allows you to focus in a very different way, because you're asking that question where, and you have someone who can say, over here on, you know, 1106 West Bennett Street, this is what's going on, and this has been the cluster with these 42 houses for the last 10 years, right? That allows you to focus those resources in a much different way and do it faster. And when you combine that with technology, you add those data points into whatever platform you're using, but for a platform like Forward, you add them in there, and it allows you to focus those resources a lot faster and to get them out of the door. You know, but there are also, I think, for folks on this webinar, tax credits and tax incentives for businesses and for individuals. Those go directly to the individual and directly to the business, whether it's an S Corp, a C Corp, an LLC, or an LLP. But again, we started this off by understanding, by asking the question and sort of saying, understand what's in the, you know, what's in the bill. And it's often those tax credits that big companies grab, but that individuals and smaller companies don't grab because they don't have the resources to know what's in it. Yes. And in some instances, let's just be honest, some people are afraid of the IRS, especially in communities of color and communities that have been challenged over the years. They're afraid of the IRS.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mason. And with that, this concludes our first webinar. We look forward to providing just more valuable information and strategy into the marketplace. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being with us and sharing their expertise. Dr. Goldsmith and Mr. Mason, thank you again for providing your time, and in absence, Mr. Kwame Reed, and also Mayor Richardson, whom had to depart. But we will share this information broadly. For those of you that have signed up for strategy sessions, a Forward policy expert will connect with you shortly to begin coordinating your customized strategy session that we can deploy the strategy shared on today to help you all effectively utilize this landmark package, really spearheaded and offered by the Biden-Harris administration for the benefit of communities and businesses around the nation. Thank you all so very much.